Thank you everyone for joining in. We're very excited to hear Dan. We want this to be a very informal, a very dialogic, a very collaborative session. So if anybody is yapping too much, please cut us. It's okay. We won't mind. And we would want it to be a very convivial space. And in that spirit, I would like to invite Vasna to give us a context of why these sessions are happening, what's going on, why are we meeting once a month, and who's organizing this. And then I will tell you who is Dan, and then Dan will tell you more about the project, and so on. Okay, we will have a 1 hour, 30-minute session. We are not going to have it in a typical webinar style. We are going to organize ourselves in smaller groups. And Dan just told me that if I use the word breakout, it looks like people are running out of prison. So I will not use the word breakout, and I will call it small groups, and we will try to be as interactive as possible. Over to you, Vasna.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have all of you here to join this discussion, which I hope will be an intimate and open sharing of experiences and learning within the group. This webinar is part of a series of webinars titled Learning for Alternative Futures, and it is one that has been set up under the banner of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which is a process that I am part of the core group of. And the Global Tapestry of Alternatives is about finding the opportunities of radical alternatives to the hegemonic system, which we recognize as being colonial, capitalist, patriarchal, Western, racist, and therefore not actually creating the space for sustainable and a good life, and therefore trying to highlight and weave together radical alternatives. Within that space of radical alternatives, one of the key elements is how do we share knowledge? How do we learn together? How do we find different ways of taking wisdom into emancipatory practice? And in order to do that, there's been conversations held with several endorsers of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, or GTA. That led to the creation of Pedagogue. It's the post-development academic activist group, but also a greater collaboration within the realm of this webinar series. And so it is being presented as a partnership between GTA, Pedagogue, the Radical Ecological Democracy website, EduSphere, the Universities Alliance, the Alternatives Project, and the Wellbeing Alliance. You can see the details of all of these partners on their websites, and I'll put those into the chat after this welcome. So as a collaboration, we are all groups trying to ensure that we think about learning in different ways, we think about knowledge in different ways, and we focus on both actions to be able to actually achieve that, but also how do we communicate and share in the best ways possible. So I'm really delighted that this is the second of the webinars that we have in the series, which Dan is leading for us. And I'll hand back to Pallavi to continue the session, and I'll just add our different institutions and processes into the chat. Pallavi, back to you.
Thanks, Vasna. I'm actually very delighted to introduce Dan to all of you. And it was sort of a chance meeting in the last seminar on Living Utopias that we did, that Dan sort of said, I do this sort of thing on kitchen tables with groups of women in Brazil. And I thought, who is this guy? So even before a formal invite was sent out to all of you, I quickly checked Dan, and this is what I found out. And I checked it from Google, and I found out there is a wiki page on him, by the way. And I found out that he is an active champion of performance arts, arts education, works with communities, and works with communities across the globe. So it's not just only in Brazil. I found that he has interests in Chile, in China, in Japan, in Korea. And so this global guy out there is part of several social and indigenous movements. He has also been a visiting university professor in Brazil, and now he has co-founded an initiative and believes in something called transformance pedagogies, of which we will learn more about today in today's session. He has some very famous people in his family. So his cousin, many of us have seen, Sacha Baron Cohen, if I'm pronouncing it right. Also, he himself is a playwright and a director. He is into performance arts. But what I found it exciting was, and we will see a little clip of a video that we will play from his project, is that he works with youth in a very exciting, hands-on, community engaged way of eco-pedagogies, of saving the rivers. And I think these ideas that we theorize come alive in the work that Dan does and his team does. When we decided that we will have this session with Dan, Dan said he wants to dedicate this session to a very special person. And before I begin the session, I will invite Dan to tell us more about this person.
So, good afternoon to everybody, and many thanks, Pallavi, for your introduction, and also thanks to Vasna, who I think you framed the afternoon we're going to spend, or evening and morning that we're going to spend together really clearly. I want to dedicate this session to a friend of mine. Here you can see Maria da Silva. She was assassinated in May 2011. She was an eco-pedagogue, a grandmother. And when I met her, she was studying both to become a teacher, a formal teacher, because she was already teaching, but she was also already a very, very powerful activist, both a community activist organizing women, but also taking huge, respectful, but very indignant responsibility for speaking out. And she was actually assassinated protecting this tree. She was assassinated with her partner, in Portuguese, companheiro, while they were protecting the forest on their land in the southeast of the northern state of Pará, which is the largest Amazonian state in the Brazilian Amazon. And I think the largest state in the world. It's vast. So here you can see the shape of the state of Pará. And this was the collective icon, the collective symbol that 50 leaders from 50 rural municipalities in the Amazon created together. And I'm going to tell you more about those methods and the process. But it's interesting that here you can see the rural definition of good living. And here you can see a very profound intervention that Maria and I and all the people that worked in this first pedagogy of the land undergraduate degree in the whole of Brazil. Here you can see the massive intervention in talking about reading the land. So people are not writing only with pens, they're writing with farming instruments, the cultivating of the land. They're collecting from the land, they're harvesting the land, they're breastfeeding, everything is in a relationship through nature. But literature, and specifically reading, is understood in the broadest and most poetic sense. And this session is dedicated not just to the memory of Maria and her partner Zé Claudio, it's also dedicated to the living project that they inspired, which continues to this day. Thank you, Pallavi.
Rios de Encontro dá as boas-vindas a vocês à Amazônia. E a nossa comunidade, Cabelo Seco. Nós somos todos filhos de pescadores e de lavadeiras, onde o rio Tocantins encontra com o rio Itacaiunas. O rio é nosso sustento e nossa rua principal. A ilha é o nosso pátio. Eles vêm sustentando nossa comunidade afro-indígena por séculos. Agora, as florestas, na qual criam nossos rios voadores, estão sendo desmatadas e queimadas. Nós estamos sofrendo a pior seca da história. Os nossos rios estão secando. Como nós podemos proteger a Amazônia da exploração até a morte pelas elites globais e pelas grandes mineradoras? Se a gente não souber que a gente vive na Amazônia ou que ela promove as chuvas no mundo. Então, nós criamos quintais de cultura e acordamos nossas raízes adormecidas. Nós recusamos financiamento de qualquer empresa mineradora. E, 4 anos depois, nós lançamos o nosso CD, Amazônia Nossa Terra. Jovens que eram participantes das atividades artísticas, das formações, hoje são jovens coordenadores, arte-educadores, né, que também compartilham seus saberes com a própria comunidade. Em 2016, o coletivo Afro Raiz emergiu para tornar necessidades comunitárias em projetos.
Olá, meu nome é Camila Alves, tenho 23 anos. Coordeno a parte de dança, também sou coordenadora da CIA de Dança Afromundi.
Oi, meu nome é Ebony, eu tenho 20 anos, coordeno Cine Coruja, nossa esse rádio solar. E também sou percussionista e dou aula de violão.
Olá, meu nome é Elisa, tenho 22 anos, eu coordeno os salos para resgatar plantas medicinais.
E também sou percussionista.
Olá, meu nome é Erivaldo, tenho 23 anos, sou coordenador aqui da área do audiovisual. Também sou percussionista.
Olá, meu nome é Catrine Neves, tenho 18 anos de idade, coordeno a Biblioteca Folhas da Vida e o projeto Porta em Porta. Também faço parte da CIA de Dança.
Meu nome é Emily, eu tenho 18 anos. Eu coordeno a CIA de Dança Infantil. Faço parte da CIA de Dança Afromundi.
E aqui, nossa Casa dos Rios, no coração da comunidade. Independente, abastecida por energia solar, é onde nós preparamos, criamos, pesquisamos, realizamos oficinas, ensaiamos e apresentamos. Nossa apresentação defende direitos humanos e educação pública de qualidade para todos. Em nosso almoço coletivo semanal, nós preparamos nossas grandes ações comunitárias. Nossas bicicletadas sempre têm um tema social, uma ação cultural e um destino especial. Inspira cooperação, solidariedade, autoconfiança e comunidade na prática. Cada apresentação transforma preconceito em respeito, em busca de justiça social. Nosso Festival de Pipa celebra matemática, física e aprendendo como iguais, como educação comunitária e ação cultural pela sustentabilidade. Num ambiente de cuidado, as crianças leem o vento e o céu e curtem brincar e criação, roubados na infância. E bem este ano, Afro Raiz formou um novo coletivo de Afro Raiz. Numa escola marcada por séculos e camadas de violência não resolvida. Racismo, homofobia, silêncio, submissão, cumplicidade, vergonha. Muito fraco. Num projeto para aprender autonomia, Afro Raiz inspirou uma nova performance. De autoaceitação orgulhosa, capaz de enfrentar e transformar a escola. Essa performance ecopedagógica é o que nós podemos oferecer em troca pela sua história cultural e diversidade e solidariedade com a Amazônia.
Minha mãe lavava roupa nesse rio e hoje em dia ela não tem mais contato pela poluição que a gente está vivendo aqui na Amazônia. Nada melhor do que a gente, que somos raízes da Amazônia, levar essa informação diretamente a vocês. Se a Amazônia secar, todos nós vamos trocar nossos direitos por apenas um copo de água. Proteja a maior, a mais antiga tecnologia do mundo, a Amazônia, que cria nossos rios voadores e preserva o amanhã para todos.
Cursar dança ou então artes cênicas.
Terminar o curso de História.
Minha própria casa, onde eu posso cultivar minhas próprias plantas e meus remédios.
Cursar a faculdade de cinema.
Cursar Psicologia e Pedagogia.
Formar em Psicologia.
Take over, Dan. We had some interesting discussions in our group, and what I will do is type out some of the things that they said in the chat while you take over, so you know what at least 4 or 5 of my group members were saying.
Great. I think we're a small circle here, so we can maintain a kind of spontaneous connection between questions. And I think we just need a few minutes at the end to make sure that we can think about next steps. But I want to be careful not to frame too much and to invite you to ask questions which I can then respond to. And I think it really is just being careful of 2 details. One is to make sure everyone has time to speak, and also to use the chat in a particular kind of way. Let's have an example right now. If you open the chat and over the next minute, write what you are thinking. What is the question or reflection that is at the very front of your mind at this time? And in a minute's time, I will just say, publish, print out what you have written, and then we will only use the chat as a space of publishing and of reflection. And we will all use our focus to give power to the person who's speaking. So please just in silence now, open the chat and begin that question or reflection. And in just a minute, I will call you to publish. Okay, everyone, may I invite you just to print even in the middle of a word or a phrase in the chat. And those questions will be recorded in the chat as a kind of process of publication. But also, I can pick up any of those questions afterwards. And if you have given your email or anything like that, and we haven't responded to those questions, then I can respond to them as well. So everyone, our circle is now open for the questions. Let's try and practice Paulo Freire and a pedagogy of questions. And I will respond with information and reflection in the best way that I can represent the narrative of that project you have seen. Does anyone want to begin?
Can I ask a question?
Oh, please do, yeah.
Yeah. Dan, I just wanted some information to place the work in a context. About Cabelo Seco, how large a village is it? How many people? What are the main livelihoods of the people? And in the 12 years that your project is going on, approximately how many youths have been involved?
Yeah, okay. So let me give this information because I'm sure it's important for everybody. There are 380 families, approximately 5,000 people, 2 main streets, one village square, which we transformed, as you saw, into a performance space, but also the entire village, its streets, its walls, its windows, its doors, are all spaces of the production and the exchange of knowledge and of the imagination. And this is a community, this is as you saw, the first community of Maraba City. So this is both the urban Amazon, but this is also the African indigenous population, which is discovering its own identities. Those identities are concealed by the word caboclo or cabocla, which simply means a mix of identities which are associated very much with African and with indigenous populations. But for all the people, most of the young people certainly, in the village, they didn't know they had African and indigenous roots. And they didn't even know they lived in the Amazon, because the deforestation of the region has been so intense. The community is served by 3 high schools, 1 primary school and 1 kindergarten. And those high schools, which encircle the community, interconnect with other communities with less of an African origin, but more of an indigenous origin. So we would be in direct, continuous collaboration with 5,000 people, but we would also be connecting with perhaps as many as 15,000 people. We try to avoid talking in numbers because we put great emphasis on the intimate, intimate dialogues within the individual as well as between individuals, and create pedagogies and artistic pedagogical spaces which are intimate. But because we connect with the university, as you can see, we connect with the military police, we connect with different, not just schools, but also training, teacher education centers. We have a disproportionately large interaction with the entire city. And to finalize that question about information, this is the first community, and it's called Cabelo Seco because the people of Cabelo Seco, with very strong African origins at the very beginning, a space of African resistance, a quilombo at the very beginning, they swam in the river, but they also fished in the river and washed clothes in the river. And that was the basis of both their livelihood, but also how they sustained themselves between fishing seasons. Those people, when they came out of the river, their hair was dry hair. And this kind of was the apellido, this was the nickname that they were given by the merchants that were coming to the place where the 2 rivers meet, but it's also a name that they internalized, and it's the name they use to identify themselves. So I've said also a little, just to conclude, about how they sustained themselves, fishing to sustain their families, and washing the clothes of the wealthy, as well as bathing and washing their own clothes inside the 2 rivers. Does that give you enough to begin with?
Yes, that's good.
Great. I'll take more questions so that I can kind of go deeper with each question. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Rashmi, and I was wondering, it really was an amazing film to see and the project, to see what's happening, what you're doing there. And I was wondering, could you say a little more about how it started? How did you how did you get the people to engage and respond and get, how was it generated? Because it's an amazing project, and it must have taken some years. But just wondering how you got it started there. How did you get the people involved?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, I came to that community after 10 years of work within the region with my partner, and she and I were known and we're invited. And I think that invitation is an important decolonial dimension to the process. We don't go as well-intentioned individuals who have a project to implement. We obviously have a life project, but our life project is guided by pedagogical principles of invitation, of listening. And in fact, we listened for the first 2 or 3 years that we were there. And I mean, we continue listening, of course, but we didn't work from within our own artistic languages. We worked with the artistic languages which define the popular culture and the oral culture. We were invited after winning a national award from the Ministry of Culture, which was there to compensate for the effects of accelerated economic development. So the Workers' Party, under Lula, the Lula government, was implementing a project guided by an industrial paradigm of industrial development and progress, which included the imposition of hydroelectric dams and the largest mining projects in the world, not just the largest mining projects in the Amazon. And this meant that we were dealing with the Ministry of Energy and of Development was actually paving over the gardens with indigenous plants, with all kinds of the diversity of fruits and everything else that you would find in the Amazon, as well as motivating the deforestation in order to accelerate mining. So I say this because this left the community with a very profound sense of complicity. They knew that they were destroying the rivers by looking for any kind of employment, particularly as the rivers started to become polluted. But in addition to which, this is a community that, because it has suffered generations, even centuries of genocide and exclusion and poverty, this is a community that was, in a sense, the legacies of those violations meant that people were silent, and they tended to say yes when they thought no, when they thought critically. But I had come from more than 25 years of work before I came to Brazil, working with communities which are both excluded and carry the legacies of genocide and patriarchy, and how all of that fits together within a paradigm which excludes all of the kinds of people that you saw there. So these are important dimensions. It meant that when we began by listening to song and listening to dance, and some of the dance was traditional dance, not traditional in the sense of traditional folk dance, but dances that came from the festivals of people, of young people competing for prizes to, in a way, celebrate their creativity. But it was also a place where people were learning ballet and classical ballet, and the kind of the culture of subordination, the culture of the desire to negate any kind of resistance in order to survive. That culture also inserted itself very, very seamlessly into the idealization and the authoritarian nature of ballet, of classical ballet. So we were listening to everything, and we were watching everything, and we were initially invited to create a sculpture, a sculpture which was going to monumentalize the fishing culture, which was already disappearing and being threatened by the industrialization of the Amazon. So I think that's the foundations of how we got there. And we arrived there. People have said to us since, and they said to us very early on, we wouldn't have survived a week within that community had we not practiced a culture of listening and a culture of beginning where people are. And the contradictions were deep. I mean, the nature of poverty, the nature of exploitation meant that, first of all, people didn't know they lived in the Amazon. This is the region which has the highest rates of assassination of human rights activists and of environmental activists in the world. That's according to The Guardian, which meant that people were terrified to actually speak. But it's also has the worst high school education in Brazil, which meant that people couldn't defend the Amazon, couldn't even name themselves as Amazonian, because they didn't realize they lived there. And they didn't have not just the voice and the courage, but they also didn't have the perspective on the legacies of genocide and a wider perspective on their lives. And so everything was, the whole 12 years was guided by the process of people learning who they were and identifying both their capacities as well as their needs. And the project followed the rhythm of those processes of learning. To conclude, the last very important detail is that we perceived very early on that there was an enormous amount of literacy, but it wasn't literacy based on the pen. It was literacy based on reading the river and writing in different forms, in different ways. So writing with kites, writing with dance, writing in different ways, and even mutilating themselves. And the actual mutilation, particularly among young girls, the mutilation took the form of indigenous signing and indigenous graphism, as it's called. Really fascinating. So the outcome, what that meant was that we quickly perceived an enormous amount of indigenous and African wisdom and knowledges that was pulsing beneath the silence, and particularly inside the dance. And quickly, we moved as a community. We lived in the community 7 days a week. We live in the community 7 days a week. We were active 6.5 days a week. But we quickly identified the community as a community university of the rivers. And with permission from no one, not from the Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Education, the community self-named and self-identified as the Community University of the Rivers, which integrated all of the territory of the 380 families and recognized first by the Ministry of Education, then by UNESCO, then by UNICEF. That came to, that gave yet another dimension of self-confidence and self-respect, which enabled us to accelerate many processes of personal and collective and community transformation. And the last detail, I've said that once before, but the last detail is that the young leaders of that community emerged through the artistic languages. And as they started to perform outside the community, outside the state, outside the country, in different regions, they transformed the prejudice, the racism that had been internalized both by the community and other communities around them, but they also transformed the institutional racism and the silence and judgment that surrounded so much of the community. And this enabled all kinds of processes that you saw to take place. I hope that's given you some response. You look like you want to respond.
Well, I just want to thank you. This is fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating, and I have so much more I want to ask you. But you know, I'm on the Indigenous Peoples Committee at the UN, and also the Xenophobia and Racism Committee. So I was wondering, how can you put your email? Okay, is there a way I can contact you to invite you? I mean, I think this is just an amazing project, so I need to. It would be great if you could, if in some way I could contact you for future. You know,
I'll certainly do that. I'll certainly do that, Rashmi.
Thank you.
Let me take some more questions,
yes.
And then I just want to have a few minutes at the very end to share one or two reflections about where we are today. Okay, because that video was made in 2019, 2020. Anyone else? Anyone?
Maybe it's too direct then, but I would like to ask the main difficulties you found in the territory so far.
I think that's a very important question, and thank you for being so direct. I think the primary difficulty was that we had a leadership inside the university that was very complicit with the miners, you know, particularly with the international mining, the multinational Valley, the Rio Grande, because Valley came to control the Secretariat of Culture, the Secretariat of Education. There were huge projects in the region, and Valley was also capable of both leveraging China, building global projects, which as well gave us a kind of global resonance. You know, and that I saw that very early on, and I thought it was extremely important that these young people spoke for themselves, particularly through dance and percussion and poetry and video making. All of those videos are made with the young people. Nothing is published, not one photograph, not one narrative is published without their full participation, not just their consent. But I could see very quickly that we were in a tiny community with national, continental, and global resonance. You know, and passing that to the young people and them internalizing that through twice a week through watching independent films and projecting films onto the walls of the homes. And you know, this was a university or a pluriversity in practice. It really was exciting. And the Federal University came to the community initially to continue researching the people, as it were, as objects, as fascinating objects, and then, you know, developing important masters and doctoral research. But they changed their whole perspective when the young people, and particularly their parents and their grandparents, which were mostly women, began to exchange knowledge with them. And so there was a significant institutional change in the way they perceived that community. But the leaders, both those who made up the association, the residents association leadership, as well as the people who were actively trying to become councillors or deputies, were extremely uncomfortable with young people taking all the decisions about what to do with the awards. So when we got 2 national awards from UNICEF, which at the time, $100,000 was a very significant amount of money, they were both indignant that the project didn't pass that money, as it were, to the elected representatives, you know, of the community. But they were also indignant that children, and mostly young women, you know, and their mothers, were taking all the decisions. So the grants were won, or rather, the awards were won and recycled into scholarships, which the young people then used to develop the economy of the project, but also to sustain their own families. And what that meant was that they were constantly involved. These are people who were apparently illiterate and innumerate. These were people who then came to manage budgets, to make strategic decisions about what they needed immediately, and then thinking forwards and learning the basic skills and arts of governance, but also of you know, the development of a whole program. And one by one, in pairs, these young people became the coordinators. You heard them speaking briefly about this in the video. They become coordinators of micro projects within a collective. So they are also practicing what Brecht often said was, you know, this is the simplest thing to understand, the most difficult aspect to practice, which is the practice of intercultural democracy, of transcultural democracy between generations, between genders, between different aspects of race, but also fundamentally reaching agreement through consensus, not creating new minorities. And the young people gradually, the first decision they took in that respect was to refuse any kind of award, any kind of fee from the mining companies. So they immediately separated themselves from all of the the projects, the social movements, the politics of collusion. And they identified for the city an alternative future. But they were also developing alternative pedagogies in the streets with their families, with their close friends, and taking those into the schools and training the teachers. And just the last detail, because I don't want to speak too much, they were being continuously challenged as well by the military police that carries, as the name says, a deeply authoritarian and repressive history into the streets. And we went to the headquarters, the quartel of the military police, built a collaboration, and the military police were, because they had to supervise the implementation of solar power, the implementation of hydroelectric dams in Pará, particularly Belo Monte Dam. The military police knew the impacts, the socio-environmental impacts, the economic impacts of hydroelectric dams, and were wanting to use that knowledge to create a different kind of security. So the transformation of that relationship with the military police, the transformation of the relationship with the university, where the university as an Amazonian federal university was not researching any alternative energies. And the young people took a solar-powered bicycle, or radio, which you could see in the video, to the university, to the parliament, municipal parliament, to the schools, and inspired the university to develop 4 solar energy parks. So transformed the university's relationship with alternative energies through its own practice. So there was a fascinating, inspiring transformation of the young people, both through their practice and through their collaboration or collaborations with institutions. And that meant that many resistances and difficulties began to dissolve as more and more people with more and more institutions and professions and communities wanted to participate in the project. But the greatest challenge is to say, really, and perhaps this is where I want to end on this question, the greatest challenge came from within families and with the community that wanted to see everyone develop at the same pace equally. And though they were part of a kind of community university, there were times when we saw mothers and even grandmothers clipping the wings of their young people who had traveled to New Zealand, had traveled to New York, traveled to Colombia, traveled to Porto Alegre in the south of Brazil, had traveled. And there was a deep, not envy exactly, but a kind of contradictory, confused understanding of the uneven processes of development. And I think that's something that we had to learn how to mediate, and the young people became the mediators of what we called not just intercultural, but transcultural processes of transformation. I hope, Fabrizio, I'm speaking, it's dense, this, but I'm being careful of time as well. I want to just say one other detail, if I may, which is that we needed to find languages which weren't self-censoring. And, in other words, because of the internalized nature of authoritarian cultural paradigms and narratives, because of the legacies that were carried in the skin and in the reflexes, we had to find decolonial and decolonizing languages and pedagogies. And for us, perhaps the most important was dance. And I'm talking about, in a way, African, indigenous, contemporary Amazonian dance. It was developing both an aesthetics, but it was also developing the possibility of people seeing their own silent narratives or repressed narratives or confused narratives that live in the skin and live in the body. The possibility of those people, of people being able to identify from within the safety of a community audience and seeing themselves on stage, but seeing the, for instance, the feminine history of the Amazon, transforming itself, but naming the violences and the violations that it had suffered. And so resistances to, deeply internalized racism, which manifested itself through resistance to drumming and resistance to the drum in public. Those resistances were transformed as people saw their children liberating themselves and saw young people liberating themselves, but saw the potential in school and in education, community education or popular education, saw the potential of dance to sidestep self-censorship and to name various priorities that needed both to be decolonized and transformed. But all of those difficulties that I've named were difficult. Sorry, everyone, that was a slightly more detailed response, but is anyone else thinking of something they want to say? Yes, Stephen.
You said you were going to say a few words about where the project is now, but in addition to that, this webinar series is Learnings for Alternative Futures, and I wondered if you've thought about the implications of this for elsewhere.
Yeah, no,
that's other parts of the Amazon for the world. And
yeah,
would love to hear you comment on that. And also, there are at least 2 questions in the chat. Are things written about this? Is there access to documentation about your project?
Yes. So first of all, I think it's very important that we get the email of every person here so that I can share what has been written. There's been a considerable amount written. Just to say, this is so much to say in a short period of time, but all the media are controlled by, in a way, the right, by the ruralists, by the evangelical power bases of Bolsonaro. The community voted, most of the community voted for Bolsonaro for all kinds of important reasons. But the TV, the radio, the newspaper, and all graphic production is in one building. And the building is owned by one family. And the fact that we could walk into that building at any time and everything would stop and they would grant us interviews, and particularly the young people, was both a reflection on the fact that we took care not to be identified with a particular political party or a particular social movement, but this was a good living paradigm for all. And this meant that we looked at contradictions very seriously, but we also looked at how we were not going to create other minorities, and we were not going to particularly divide families and communities against themselves. And that had come, in my experience, from working in Ireland, from working in post-industrial England, Northern England, and working in South Africa. But it come from a long process of collaboration with excluded communities. What's important, I think, to say is that, every single week we had almost a page inside the newspapers, and we were translating the kinds of concepts and insights and innovations, experiments, all the time for the whole city. And this was being read both by elected representatives, but it was also being read by all the institutions and by the kind of reflexive and brave intellectuals who are working inside the university or working inside the city in different ways. So yes, there is a lot of material that can be read. It was this conceived of as I think the project right from the very beginning understood the importance of the Amazon, the global importance of the Amazon. And I don't just mean the ecological importance, but obviously all of the other implications. I think we discovered the importance of good living in the course of the project and of ecocide. We were using the concept of ecocide and trying to popularize ecocide and good living inside the media, on TV. And my priority always was to ensure that the young people spoke in their own language through all the media. And it meant that they quickly became respected, but they also communicated both to their own communities and families, but they also communicated to other social classes and sectors within civil society, which they would have usually no access to whatsoever. It is the very interesting detail, which I'll just give you now, is that just before I left to come here to England and then to travel on, I was invited by the Secretary of Education to develop with the Secretariat a teacher education project for 225 schools and for all the teachers inside the city of Maraba. And that's interesting for two reasons. One is that it's governed by an engineer. And as the trajectory of this prefect of the mayor is not just engineering, but he is regarded as probably the most effective mayor that the city has had in terms of getting progress in terms of infrastructure really developed during his mandates. But here he is living the pandemic, witnessing and experiencing a climate collapse where people are born with asthma, where people have seen rivers turn to dust and forests become ash. He is understanding that the paradigm, the industrial paradigm of progress and development has exhausted itself, and that no one will be able to enjoy any kind of life if there isn't a really radical change. And so I just say this because it's an important initiative that an engineer and a whole administration recognizes the importance of ecological pedagogies, of ecopedagogies. Now, I, after 40 years of work, can see this as being relevant to develop with Pedagogue, for instance, not as a prescriptive program, but as a series of processes which place medicinal plants, solar energy, and governance at the core of education for everyone. So it means that the school becomes a microcosm, an ecosystem, which prepares people for prepares particularly children and teenagers for transforming their own families, their own streets, and their own communities, creating everything that you saw in that video. But it also prepares people for an accelerated process of transformation because we've run out of time. And living in a place where time, where the time we have has been exhausted, you then face a very deep pedagogical question, which has been faced by political or politicized artists and pedagogues for many centuries, which is how do you respect the time that each individual, family, and community needs in order for it to learn and take decisions actively, and at the same time, ensure that that process responds to the real limits that we are facing, ecological limits and existential limits that we are facing as a human race. And that really brings me to the three questions that we are asking ourselves today inside the project. The project has completed its first 12 years. We've asked those young people that you saw in the video to now embrace other projects, get other kinds of experience, discover the depth of motivation that they have independently of the project, independently of us, so that they can discover their own strength and their own persistence, their own resilience, and not become dependent upon us as coordinators. But we have also faced, this transition of the pandemic, and it's caused us to reflect very deeply. And I've spent much of the last year working with indigenous peoples in the Amazon and in the northeast of Brazil. And I can now formulate three questions that I will give to you as where our project is today. The first question is, how can we transform time on time? So it's a pedagogical question. How do you transform time? Sounds very philosophical, but it's actually very practical. The second is, how do you indigenize the city? At the present time inside Brazil, two parliamentary bills threaten the existence of all indigenous civilizations inside Brazil, but also to threaten to accelerate the industrialization, the mining of all public space inside Brazil. So the question here is not to overlook the importance of protecting the guardians of the Amazon and protecting the guardians of rivers, trees, and forests. It's not also only a question of how do you ensure that the rights of nature can be legislated so that forests, rivers, and mountains and land can be protected by law from mining companies, from politicians, from any kind of violation. But it's actually how do you extend indigeneity from the past into the future? And this is extremely important. This is to say for us, to say, you know, how does the question of originary roots, of indigenous roots in the past, how can that be extended into indigenous roots or everyone claiming indigeneity in the future? So this is a question about, it's a pedagogical question, but it's also a question which reframes and reinvents what is indigenous, rooting in a particular territory, rooting in a particular project. How do you enable that to take place? And the last is how can you popularize the originary Andean paradigm of good living, and good living as a reciprocal relationship with all the species within nature, both within the city and outside the city. So that's where we are at the moment. We're asking ourselves those questions, but we understand that transforming this kind of project into programs, that transformation is essential. I don't think I answered one question, and I'm not going to try now, about what is transformance. I think Pallavi raised that question in a sense, but transformance is simply the transformation, social, community-based, family-lived transformation through performance, and understanding performance in the narrow sense of understanding that all public and intimate space follows the principles of, well defined by Augusto Boal, of public and intimate space as a space of power governed by gaze, by agency, and by narrative. So I'm not going to unpack that just now, but just to say there's that narrow understanding of performance, but there's a wider understanding of performance, which is understanding that all space is a space of performed narratives, and narratives that come from the past and come from the gaze of the future. And that understanding of performance is empowering. If teachers knew that, they would use the theatre of the classroom and the theatre of learning in a very different way. But if we all knew that, if every citizen knew that, they would also find ways of practicing participatory democracy that didn't create theatres of complicity and exclusion. And so it's understanding that transformation is based on that kind of performance literacy, which is never taught in theatre, in teacher education, never. I think I've said as much as I can in response to your, not just to your question, Stephen, but to other people's questions. I should really just say, I want to end with a poem, but I should really say, if we're respecting the time here, I should say that I think we are one of many projects throughout the world that I think you probably know very well in Pedagog, and particularly inside, particularly for instance, inside India, that I know has an extraordinary richness and diversity of transformative paradigms through the arts. But I should also say that the potential for this kind of this kind of pedagogical transformation has never been so great. I get the impression that the existential experience that the world has lived in the pandemic, traumatic though it has been in many regions and for many of the most vulnerable peoples in the world, that has created a great potential. And I think we need to use that potential with great care so that it doesn't become populist and authoritarian. I have Pallavi, can I just read a poem which brings back into focus? And can I ask everyone for your permission to, in a sense, propose that this is a pause in this conversation and we can bring this conversation back. I'm sure Pallavi has ideas to propose. But if I can read you this poem written by the sister of Zé Claudio Ribeiro, the partner of Maria Silva, but it's for Maria, it's about Maria. It brings back into really sharp focus the extremely dangerous situation inside the Amazon and in really all places where indigenous or originary peoples are trying to protect the future. And of course, our future. So I'm going to just read you this poem, and I've given it to Jacqueline, who is our translator. So Pallavi, with your permission, I just close with this poem here. So it's called Viva Maria Viva. I was there, strong and serene, in the same place for years. I served you with my beauty and fruit. And suddenly, I no longer exist. You approached not to harvest or to embrace me, but to begin your ritual. I cried with pain, but you silenced me, bit by bit, devastating me until I fell to the ground. But I still have roots. I will shoot up, yes, between the teeth of your chainsaw. And I share that poem with you, remembering not just Maria, but just to name one, the Mundaraku leader, Alexandra Mundaraku, who is being intimidated 24 hours a day, a mother of children and grandchildren, but a remarkable indigenous leader of a people that demarcated their own territory and refused to wait for any government to legalize their land claim. I'm saying that because I think if anybody wants to translate this dialogue into any kind of solidarity with these vulnerable communities, if you get in touch with me afterwards, we can think about that together in the context of a reciprocal exchange. That's to say, not one direction of solidarity, but an exchange of knowledges and resources, so that who gives also receives and learns through the process. I want to say thank you, Pallavi and Vasna and Irvi and Stephen, people who made this meeting possible. And I pass back to you, Pallavi, the final words.
I think the final words have to come from all of us. It was a very nice session. I'm sure everyone will agree. And yeah, I just want to say a very deep thanks for giving us reflective points on things that we reflect on as teachers, as community organizers, as performance theater artists, as people worried about various things that are going on. So very quickly, thanks from me for sure. But if anybody wants to join me, please unmute yourself and give your special thanks to Dan.
Thank you very much this has been a really enlightening session for me anyway, and very, very substantive, very, very deep understandings. and very important. And I really want to, thank you very much for coming and sharing this. And I'm so glad I tuned in to this session. And it would be great to be able to reach you and stay in touch.
Thank you for everything you try to make us sense of, because I know it's quite hard to translate the very complexity of working in the Amazon. And I congratulate. I really want to keep in touch and get to know any news from the project. I didn't know anything about it before entering the session, and I told about a contact that it occurred to me, and I'm leaving my email too. But I'm very appreciative of such projects.
Thanks, Fabrício.
Eu fico muito inspirada, Dan, e meu coração está contente. Obrigada.
Valeu, amiga. I've placed my email in the chat there for anybody who would like to copy the chat. I mean, but also it's there. If everybody wants to put their email, I can certainly create a collective email which ensures that any publications are available. I think it's pretty clear as well that we've been using the arts not as a part of culture, but as the expressions of people's diverse intelligences within an integral intelligence. So you'll look, but if you have particular interest in aesthetics or how we were able to create dance, theatre and video and everything else, I can respond to those too. I think this is a good moment as well to put your reflections in the chat, and we can learn from your experience today and other experiences.
I mean, things look so hopeless most of the time. So it's sometimes nice to just hear some things that work, and even though imperfectly, they do work. There's excitement, there's creativity. So yeah, it's nice to have that sense as well from time to time.
Well, Pallavi, I think you've touched something very important, which is, I didn't mention that we are not content with resistance. I mean, we are looking for a kind of enchanting, inspiring experience, and often the arts are really fundamental to that, and particularly the arts, not just of poetry, which is very reflexive, but to the arts of celebration, and particularly to ritual. And I think we didn't talk about that, but we can. And perhaps, Pallavi, we should say that everybody who is here today is welcome to come to the next session that will be organized. And perhaps this can be part of a continuing dialogue.
Yes, yeah, thanks for reminding. We're all part of these networks, and we would like any one of you who would like to carry this conversation forward, highlighting some of your work. You're welcome. We can mark a day. Please share, organize a webinar. We can discuss formats and showcase some of an interesting thing that you're part of, of. And yeah, you're very welcome to write to us.